Welcome to Let's Chat Core. I'm Sarah Brown Wessling. Today's topic is simplifying text complexity. Our learning purpose today is to learn what comprises text complexity and how to incorporate it purposefully in the classroom. If you're anything like me, knowing where something like text complexity resides within the whole scheme of the Common Core State Standards is really helpful in understanding its purpose and how we use it. So let's take a look at those standards once again. Now, if you remember, we have the math standards, and we also have the literacy standards. Within those literacy standards, there are four large strands. There's the writing strand, the reading strand, the speaking and listening strand, as well as the language strand. When we take a closer look at reading, we'll find that text complexity is right within that. This lets us know that text complexity is important in helping us choose the kinds of text that we put in front of our students. One of the goals of reading is to help our students grow in their ability to comprehend. And so choosing the correct text to put in front of them, or the best text, the right fit kind of texts in front of our students becomes really crucial. Now, I just want to remind everybody though that just because text complexity is within reading, is within literacy, it's not just about those English language arts teachers. In fact, text complexity is for any teacher who is putting primary text in front of our students. And as we know, this component of the standards is for all teachers. All teachers in all disciplines are being asked to put primary text in front of their students so that our students really come to understand the role of literacy in that discipline. I think it's time to really unpack what this text complexity is all about. So I kind of want to offer my teacher working definition of text complexity. First of all, when I hear that phrase text complexity, it sounds a little bit scary. That the word complexity in and of itself makes it sound as though the point of this is to put text in front of our students that are really difficult and really hard. And while it is true that we want to make sure that we are constantly challenging our students and constantly giving them something that's just a little bit out of their comfort zone so that they can always be growing in their comprehension, we also need to understand that text complexity is about all of the nuances, the complex ways in which we think about and determine which kinds of text to put in front of our students. And so one of the first myths that we really need to deconstruct here is the idea that just by putting a text that's difficult in front of our students, that's going to make them better readers, because we know that's not true. We know that really it's a lot more nuanced in terms of our approaches. In fact, when I talk to my students about the kinds of texts that are in front of them and the things that we want to read, I want them to find a just right approach. I want them to make sure that they aren't reading something that is so easy that they're not growing, they're not thinking. But I also want to make sure that they're not reading something so challenging that they're having to look up every other word and not being able to string together any kind of comprehension when it comes to that text. So it's important to kind of, I call it the three bears approach. Not too easy, not too hard, just right. But we want to make sure that as we're finding that just right kind of sweet spot for our students, that we're always dialing it up just a tiny bit so that over the course of a year or over the course of a semester or over the course of an experience, students will be able to constantly grow in that way. Not only do we need to make sure that we are putting just right text in front of our students, but when we think about text complexity, it's not just about the difficulty of the text, it's also about the kind of text. And this is a way that we can add complexity to kind of the fabric of our classrooms. So yes, students need to read fiction. Yes, they need to read nonfiction, but they also need to be able to read infographics and poetry and film and music videos and graphic novels. And this is why this is so important. If we don't give students the opportunity to transfer their reading skills from one genre to another, one type of text to another, then they kind of become stagnant. And so part of creating text complexity is giving them a variety of texts in order to read. And you know, we probably know this as teachers, as adults, we probably intrinsically understand this because there are times when we encounter texts that are more complex for us, and we have to really slow down when we learn to transfer some of those skills. So when we think about approaching a text, We want to make sure that we are teaching our students those skills of questioning and making inferences and being able to paraphrase and tracing an argument or tracing a thought, but they have to be able to do it in a variety of circumstances. So whether it is a lab report or a blog or a comic book or a financial document, they have to be able to take those skills, reapply them, and that's how we create the kind of environment for our students in which they're not just looking for a right answer. It's how we create the kind of environment that they need in order to really foster some lifelong literacy skills. Another way for us to really think about text complexity, especially in ways to think about adjusting that text complexity, is how we layer the text that we offer students. So, for example, if we are just giving students a text and keeping that in isolation, we'll be able to teach them some skills in order to make sense of that text. And we might even be able to give them a different kind of genre later and ask them to transfer those skills. But another way to consider this is to think about layering texts. So what about having 3 texts kind of in a bundle for students? Maybe there's a comic strip, maybe there is an infographic, maybe there is a journal article, maybe in another bundle you have a piece of fiction, you have a music video, you have a poem. In those contexts, what you're doing is you're getting students to look at the relationship between these texts, and when they have to compare these texts, either in terms of structure, in terms of vocabulary, in terms of content, in terms of concept, they're going to have to start to dig deeper, and they're going to have to start to look at some of the complex ways in which these texts work. So that's a third way for us to think about bringing text complexity into the classroom. Let's now take a look at how the core really gives us a visual for this text complexity and how the core defines it. So within Appendix A, you'll find that there's this great triangle graphic, and it divides text complexity up into 3 components: the qualitative, the quantitative, and the reader and the task. So what I'd like to do right now is kind of break down these 3. There's some wonderful resources in the appendix that you can read and get a lot of more comprehensive detail, but I want to again just kind of put this in some teacher language for us. So first of all, I want to talk about that quantitative component. And the quantitative component for me, if I think quantitative and computer, I think about this element as the parts of a text that can be measured by computer software. So this is the word length, the frequency, the sentence length. A lot of you have probably heard about Lexile scores. This is where Lexile scores come from, and this is important because Lexile scores can give us insight into the difficulty of a text, and so it becomes really important. However, we also know that Lexile scores can sometimes be misleading, and I will tell you that when I first read the core and I read this section on text complexity, I felt so liberated because for so long I have been hearing about making sure that we have the right Lexile score for the right kind of reader. And while I agree with that, I've also always known and always believed that sometimes that just doesn't make sense. That, you know, Ernest Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises has a pretty low Lexile score because of the way that he writes his sentences, but I know I'm not putting that book in front of a lot of students who may be able to comprehend the words but not understand the style, not understand the language, not understand the context, and certainly not be ready for the content that's going on in there. So it's important for us to remember that one of the advantages of thinking about text complexity is it's giving us permission to use Lexile scores but also go beyond them. So in addition to the quantitative, we have the qualitative. And the qualitative is kind of in reference to what I was just talking about. This is the human reader. This is the components of any text that can really best be measured by an attentive reader. So an attentive reader can determine the difficulty of language, the purpose of the text, the clarity of it, the kinds of background knowledge demands that a reader might have or might need in order to effectively read this kind of a text. I think one of the best ways to maybe exemplify this is just to offer you an example from one of the favorite parts of my day, which is when I get to read bedtime stories to my own children. So a couple of months ago, I brought home a really fun poetry book that I thought would be great for us to read together. So we're reading this at night, and my 8-year-old is reading the poems, and he knows all of the words in there. And the first 2/3 of every poem he really gets, and he's smiling and kind of laughing. But at the end of every poem, it kind of has a shift, and there's a little bit of a metaphor at the end of every poem. And I realized that I was still laughing at the end of the poem, and he wasn't. Even though he could read every word, he wasn't unpacking the metaphors yet. And so there's a certain degree of background knowledge that he had to have. And when I was able to provide that background knowledge and talk to him about what this double meaning is actually all about, then he was able to make sense of it. But we have to remember that this doesn't just apply to 8-year-olds who are reading poetry with their moms at 8 o'clock at night. It also means that anybody who is working with a text that's unfamiliar to them, or may have vocabulary that they are unfamiliar with, may have text structures that they aren't certain about, will encounter this same kind of difficulty, and so that makes a difference. Another example is when I have oftentimes put graphic novels in front of teachers during some kind of workshop or professional development, and you should see the look on their faces, because a lot of adults maybe haven't read a lot of graphic novels, and so they're not quite sure, where do I start? What do I read next? Do I read the things in the bubbles? How does this work? So until you have had access and experience and background knowledge and understanding some of these structural elements of any given text, that qualitative complexity is dialed up. And so we need to think about that. The third component of text complexity is also another area that I have felt really validated in. The reader and task element of this essentially lets us know that the teacher is so crucial in making sure that the task that he or she is asking the student to do with that text is a really good match. And in just a bit, I'll talk about how we can use this matching as a way to dial up or dial down the text complexity. But when we think about the marriage between reader and task, learning purpose becomes absolutely crucial. As teachers, we must know what our purpose for teaching is, what we want students to learn, and what our purpose for putting that particular text in front of the student is. Because when we have a clear understanding of that purpose, I think we are much more likely to be able to connect the reader and the task in really beneficial ways. So now that we've kind of broken down these three components of text complexity, I want to go back to the classroom, and I want us to spend the end of this webinar kind of thinking about what it actually means to teach with text complexity in mind. So the first thing is that if I am teaching with text complexity in mind, I have to know my students. I have to know what their background knowledge is. I do have to know about their Lexile score or what their reading ability is, but I can't make all of my determinations based on that single criteria anymore. And that is what I think is so wonderful about the three-pronged approach to text complexity, is that it gives us an opportunity to see readers in a more multifaceted way, and it gives us a chance to see our texts in a more multifaceted way. So we have to know our students, their background knowledge, their vocabulary needs, the kinds of structures that they're familiar with and the ones that they're unfamiliar with. And when we know that, we'll be able to offer them and give them texts that are just right for them, and texts that allow them to continue to grow as readers. The second thing that we really can do in order to make sure that we are adhering to text complexity in purposeful ways is to have a good match between that task and text. So my personal philosophy on the text that I have and use in class is that the more difficult the skill that I am teaching, or the more complex the concept is that I want to teach, the less difficult the actual text needs to be, the more accessible that actual text needs to be. So for example, when I am working with seniors who are studying literary theory, which is something that is often done in colleges and universities, and it's a way that literary critics look at literature, I don't introduce that to them with Beowulf or Shakespeare or even Catcher in the Rye. Instead, we start with nursery rhymes because nursery rhymes are really accessible pieces of text. They're short, you can reread them many times, you can unpack them quickly, and what it allows them to do is it allows them to practice these complex thinking and conceptual skills with very accessible text. And once they own those skills, then we start to dial up the complexity of the text, and that's a good match between them. So it's important for us to remember, the more difficult the task, the more difficult the concept, the more accessible the text. Finally, I think that there is a mistake that I know I have certainly made in the classroom, and I think it's one that I have really learned from, which is this idea of trying to walk through the exit door, that instead of thinking about starting right where my students are at and scaffolding them towards some end, exit point that I want them to achieve, sometimes I get nervous. I get nervous when I look at those standards. I get nervous when I think about the expectations that we have for our students. And I think, if I start too easy, or if I start too slow, if I start with texts that are too short, we're never going to get there. And what I have learned is that if I put texts that are too difficult, those exit level texts, if I put those exit level texts in front of my students at the beginning before they're ready, it's completely unproductive. They're not able to work with them, they're not able to learn from them, and instead it's so much more effective to start slow, to start with accessible text, and to consistently work up, so that when they get to those really complex texts, they feel confident, they feel ready, and they're really able to flourish. Now that we have demystified a little bit of text complexity, broken down those three major components, done a little bit of thinking about how we might consider implementing this in the classroom, I wanted to offer a few reflective prompts that might get you to think about how to apply this to your own teaching scenario. So the first prompt reads, one way to start thinking about matching text and readers is to begin with what you already have. So take a text that you teach frequently. Now consider how you would make that text more complex by changing the task. So this is one way that we dial up text complexity. We change the task, not the text. A second prompt for you to think about. Now take a task that is often very challenging for students. Think about how you could scaffold it with more accessible text. So I want you to think about shorter texts. I want you to think about non-traditional texts. Are there ways that you can match text with task in that way? Finally, another way to increase complexity is in juxtaposing or comparing texts. So how could you take a central text that you have in your class? How could you make it more complex through comparison? Conversely, how could you make it more accessible? These are some good questions for us to think about, for us to ponder, perhaps for us to collaborate with others on as well. Thank you for joining me with this edition of Let's Chat Core. Just a couple of reminders. Text complexity is relevant to all readers, all teachers. Text complexity is never determined by a single characteristic. And teachers must make purposeful matches between text, task, and reader. Thank you so much for learning with me today. It's always a pleasure for me to be able to unpack my thinking and share my teacher voice in trying to make sense of all of this Common Core work. If you enjoyed this webinar, you may enjoy some of the others that you can find on teachingchannel.org, and also look forward to the upcoming blogs and more webinars in this series. Thanks again.